Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Jason, your podcast host, creator of Historians of the Movies, benevolent dictator of all things HATM related. I don't know, something. I got something special for you today. I've got Charlie Pierce, and I am so excited. If you know anything about Charlie, Charlie is the political commentator for Esquire. He's been their political commentator since like 2011, but he's got a career that goes back into political commentary and journalism that goes back 4 or 5 decades. He has been all over the place. He's from Massachusetts. You'll hear his accent come through a little bit today. And Charlie's a guy I've been following for the longest time. On Twitter, we became friends years ago, and I'd wanted to get him on the podcast. And then he reached out to me and said, hey, I want to be on the podcast and I want to do Deadline U.S.A. And I said, absolutely. Also, what's Deadline U.S.A.? But it's this movie that comes out in 1952 with Humphrey Bogart, one of the classic guys, right? And it's about the collapse of this newspaper in the early 1950s and the political corruption around it. And it turns out that this movie, which I watched twice before we did this pod, is incredibly prescient, not only for 1952, but all the way until 2023. So Charlie and I get into this movie, what this means in the early 1950s and the height of the Red Scare and all these things. And then also how it relates to 2023 and our current age. And plus the whole gamut of things he's seen over the multitude of decades. He's been talking about America, American politics, and all these other things have gone on. It's such an awesome talk to sit down and talk to Charlie, who is maybe the coolest dude you're ever going to meet. So it was an absolute thrill to talk to him about this movie. I think you guys are going to love it. You can find this movie on YouTube. So if you haven't seen this film yet, pause this podcast and go watch it on YouTube. I'll put a link to it on the Twitter thread that we put that out here as well. It's such a great time to talk to Charlie. He's one of my most favorite people. And I think after you listen to this pod, he's going to be one of your most favorite people as well. So sit back and relax because Deadline USA is next at Historians of the Movies podcast. Charles Pierce, what's going on, man? How are you?
Hey, it's good to see you, my friend. It's always nice to see what that the people on Twitter look like. That they really look like you think they look because everybody fudges their avatar picture.
I gotta tell you, I'm guilty of that at the same time. Like every time like I post like a stupid gym pic, maybe it's a little bit like I'm messing with the lighting. I'm like, you know what, this would look a little bit. Let me just enhance.
Sure, I mean, maybe you're posing a little, you're flexing a little bit. Everybody's entitled to flex. Twitter is not real life, so you can be anything you want.
It's not, but I'll tell you what, the weird part is how many people I've met off of Twitter. Like, okay, so you and I were just talking like off mic a second ago about like my Denver experience. Like I almost married a woman that I met off of Twitter. Last year I ended up flying out to Texas to climb a mountain with 2 guys I'd never even met them before. And like they were like, come to Colorado or come to Texas and climb a mountain. I'm like, you don't have mountains in Texas like we do. And come. And I'm climbing a mountain with them. And other people, and I think it actually does this really cool thing because take a person like Joanne Freeman, who I never would have talked to.
I love my network of historians.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, when I was a graduate student in Minnesota, even though I was like an older graduate student, I finished, my all my work like last year. So I was like 44, 45 when I was finishing up. Even guys that you would think that I wouldn't have a problem talking to, guys like Kevin Cruz, I probably never would have, because they're so high up in like my professional echelon. I'd never would have like stomached come up with a chutzpah to like go and talk to him,
Yeah.
But Twitter breaks all that down, and for better or worse.
Plus, it's fun to watch all these really respectable intellects at play.
It is.
Nobody has more fun on Twitter than Cruz does.
No, Chris is great. It also puts a target on your back, and I'll tell you that, I've talked to some very good friends of mine. I'll name drop a couple of buddies, but like a very close friend of mine is Craig Bruce Smith. I don't know if you follow him or not. He does Early America and stuff like that. He's a great guy. He's a really terrific guy. He's been a great friend for a lot of years. And Craig and I are always kind of talking because he'll kind of call me out. He's like, he goes, "Are you being you, or are you being a version of you on social media?" Because I feel like there is a bit sometimes of I don't want to be in that thing where I'm like virtue signaling and stuff like that. I mean, I like to think I've got virtue, a very small amount of it, but I don't know. I hope that guys like Cruise or say Heather Richardson or these people who have these very deep. I'm the movie guy at this point in time. I'm like, you guys want to watch Goodfellas? At this point in time, which is fine and good. I do turtles in movies.
I've noticed that historians at the movies has moved more into movies than historians.
Yeah, and
it began as history movies.
Oh yeah, it definitely did. But that actually kind of changed, and I think that kind of changed because my relationship to films changed. As I started to think about movies, is like, we started off like that very first movie you did was National Treasure, right? Way back when. And that plays kind of fast and loose with history in a fun way. And we did some like straight up history movies. And then the very first time we did a movie like Trading Places, I was like, wait a second. This isn't a quote unquote history film, but is there a movie that isn't? There's so much, if it's not a history film, is it a historical artifact? We get into this movie we're watching today.
Oh, Deadline U.S.A. is both an artifact and prescient.
All right, so you and I, this is like the fourth time we've tried to do this podcast. We've been trying to get together for the longest time to do this, and you had said, "Hey, I want to do the pod." I was like, "All right, name the movie," and you came and I was like, "Okay." You said Bogey. I was like, "Sweet, Bacall's right around the corner." There's no Bacall. There's no Lauren Bacall in here.
Jim Backus, though, the voice of Mr. Magoo.
Is that right?
As the gossip columnist, Jim Cleary. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I was not familiar with Deadline USA at all before you had suggested it. But we actually in the early days of HATM, we did the River Queen or the African Queen. Excuse me, the African Queen, not the River Queen. Yeah. The African Queen with Bogart. And
Katharine Hepburn.
Katharine Hepburn. God, everybody's got a favorite from that era, and mine's probably Teresa Wright, just because she was in Best Years of Our Lives.
Right.
But Katharine Hepburn, for me, I've got a soft spot for Kate.
Well, I think in the opening after the great scene at the newspaper wake in the bar, where Bogey turns up at his ex-wife's place. I think Kim Hunter is very sexy in that scene.
Oh my God, yes.
He wakes her up in the middle of the night and starts nuzzling her neck and stuff.
Well, I mean, this is an interesting version of Bogey, and I'm not as versed on Bogart as maybe I should be, because now that I've got you for this one, I would happily do a whole slew of Bogart films, because Bogart, for people, like, this is the oldest film we've done now in the pod, and I'm excited about it. I don't know that a lot of people have seen this, and I think they should.
Well, it's on YouTube for free.
Yeah, I've watched it twice now. Like you were saying, it's a really interesting film. Comes out in 52, so they're making it 51-ish or so.
Yeah, they're thereabouts. Yeah,
and it's talking a lot about newspapers in its era, in its time. But man, 70 something years later, this movie feels like you could make this movie right now. Am I wrong?
I mean, the newspapers being bought out by a larger newspaper. Everybody's going to lose their jobs. Everybody, all of the people in the movie have already lost newspaper jobs somewhere. Mm-hmm. His Bogart's assistant, or I guess it's the city editor. Talks about having worked at the New York World with Joe Fonda Pulitzer. So I mean, there's some real state of the art. I can never pronounce this word. Verisimilitude.
Verisimilitude sounds good. Yeah.
Yeah. In the shots in how cramped the newspaper room is, and the fact that it's a really good newspaper, but it can't make any money, so it's going to be sold. That's the conundrum that plagues newspapers to this day. Quality doesn't matter anymore. Well, it matters even less now than it did in 1952.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things I want to talk about real fast. So for folks who were not, before we jump into this movie, you've got a very real relationship with newspapers, with journalism, and so forth. So maybe you can talk a little bit about, introduce yourself a little bit about like your own career and like what it is that you're doing, and like maybe we can talk a little bit about how that relates to this film.
Well, I mean, I bounced in my career. I have worked now for 2 newspapers and a news site that have folded. So I know what being on that end of the stick is like. Although I was only working for one of them when it folded. I was working for the National when it folded. But the Boston Phoenix went out of business 10 years ago, and that's where I wouldn't be where I am without that place. And of course, Grantland went out from under me. What? Maybe no, God, it's got to be 10 years now. Maybe a little less than that. So yeah, I mean, I know. I mean, I understand that very little about this craft was permanent before the internet, and the internet has made sure nothing is permanent anymore.
It's interesting that you say Grantland because Simmons has been such a kind of an influence in my own work just because when he comes out with The Ringer later on after Grantland folds, and then he's got I'm very happy to he's got a podcast called The Rewatchables. It's really a direct influence on this as I started to get into it. Although I always like to say this is kind of like The Rewatchables, only with historians, and you don't have to listen to Bill Simmons talk.
Well, that they did when they did the rewatchables on Rounders. They were talking about the staff of Grantland, and they were casting the characters in Rounders with people who worked for Grantland, and I was casting the Martin Landau role, which I was very proud of.
Yeah, I love that. I love that role.
But in any event, no, Bill's interesting because Bill and I both were afflicted with roughly the same sickness of ambition. I got in trouble in J school because I wrote better than anybody on the faculty. I got in trouble at the Boston Herald because I was light years better than anybody there. Simmons was the same way. Simmons was working at the Boston Herald after I left. But what I found after I got out of J school, I worked for Worcester Magazine, which was an alternative newspaper in my hometown in Massachusetts, until I got fired 2 days before Thanksgiving because the editor was an idiot and he didn't agree with my assessment of his talents. And then I threw a tape dispenser through a window. So that was how I left there. But I got out from, when you go to J school, they give you the ladder. You're supposed to work, in Waukesha, and then you're supposed to work in Appleton. And if you're very, very lucky, you get to work in Milwaukee when you're like 35. That was not for me. But I found, after I got fired from Worcester Magazine, I found the Boston Phoenix, and that was my way out off the ladder. Bill was stifled at the Boston Herald. He was, working the night sports desk. He found the internet and did the same thing. I mean, outside of Josh Marshall and maybe Drudge, I can't think of anybody who saw the potential of the internet sooner than Bill did.
I remember I was selling mortgages when maybe selling cars, maybe selling mortgages. This would have been early 2000s when he's Boston sports guy, and then he moves up to I think page 2 on ESPN at some point in time.
Yeah.
And I remember at the time being electrified by his writing. And I say this about kidding a little bit earlier about having to listen to his voice because sometimes I'll listen to him and he just butchers the language. That said, for what he did and then constructing great, really from going from a writer with this really witty kind of thing and sticking to his guns, and then branching from understanding that sports and pop culture are so tied together and how we internalize the two.
And he's also a hell of a talent scout.
Yes.
He finds, the young people he found to work at Grantland were, from Barnwell to, the Hollies, Holly Anderson. I can't remember the other Holly's name. Yeah. Katie Baker. Mm-hmm. These are all very young people that he found and turned loose. So, I have no complaints with Grantland. In fact, I really thought that after Bill left, ESPN would keep Grantland going just to prove it could run it without Bill. Just out of institutional, ego, but I was wrong.
Well, he was definitely watching from afar, and I really only saw. It's not like ESPN was publishing its side of the story, but Bill was from the outside. For those of us watching his fan base, for his fan base, kind of seeing like he was not afraid to go up against the system there against ESPN, and I remember he would get called out a few times, get shut down a bit, and I guess maybe his frustration with that ultimately led to his departure. Seems like he's done okay.
He's done fine. Hey, didn't he sell the Ringer for like $11 gazillion or something
to Spotify? I want to say the only Spotify paid, I think maybe more for Rogan's podcast rights.
Yeah,
and I want to say that the Ringer, but my favorite podcast I listen to is actually another movie podcast on the Ringer Network called The Big Picture with Sean Fennessy and some other folks like that are terrific, insightful folks.
Fennessy was another Grantland hire.
Yeah, really, I really like him. He's a really insightful guy. But you did not go the exodus to to the Ringer, you're an Esquire. Are you there exclusively?
I've been at Esquire in one capacity or another since 1997.
No kidding. I didn't know your roots went that far back.
Yeah, I came over when we all wrote Tommy Junot, Scott Rabb, Cal Fussman, Mike Sager, Peter Richmond. We all worked for David when he was an AME at GQ under Art Cooper. And when David took over Esquire, which was at the point he took it over at the bottom of the ocean. Let nobody ever mistake the fact that David Granger saved that title.
Really?
There weren't even phones in the office when we got there. He brought Tom and Scott and Cal and Mike and I over. Peter stayed at GQ. And, that was in 97. The last piece I wrote for GQ was the Tiger Woods piece. That was the April cover in 1997. And I was working at Esquire by the end of the last month, the end of the next month, the end of May.
So you were very busy today. I saw you on Twitter, X, whatever. I don't know what we're calling it today. And we're recording now. It's 8:30, almost 8:30 your time. I'm here in the mountains. Mm-hmm. You're East Coast. What does your day look like now that you're with Esquire? Does constructing a piece when you write it, does this take a long time? Or are you writing these things within a single day? How does this operate for a journalist?
Well, one of the gifts I have is I can write very, very fast. I tend to see in paragraphs. I don't see in words and sentences. So generally, magazine editors love me for that. They'll give me notes on a piece and I'll turn it around in a day. I've just always been able to do that no matter where I worked. And of course, the internet. I've been working exclusively pretty much on the internet now since 2012. I was at the Boston Globe Sunday Magazine for 9 years in between 2002 and 2011. And then I got the offer from Esquire to come write the politics blog. At the same time, I got the offer from Grantland to do columns for them. And so I had sort of run up my string at the Globe and had some conflicts with upper echelons and, went and came over to full-time, internet writing. I still do the occasional piece for the Dead Tree version of Esquire. But, it's my day begins, usually around 6:30 or 7. I'll go to the websites. I'll look at the Washington Post. I'll look at the New York Times. I'll look at the LA Times. I'll look at Politico. I'll see what's happening on the blogs. And then usually I have the first post of the day ready to go. I write it like the night before, or I have the subject the night before, and then I just step right into it. And then I just, follow the news as it goes along. And if something piques my interest, I once explained when I was writing a column at the National, Frank DeFord told me that I had to balance what I was, if I made a snarky joke about Republicans, I had to make a snarky one about Democrats. And I tried to explain to Frank, look, a column, and I would say now a blog, it's like my house. I decide what goes on the wall. I decide what I serve for dinner. I decide what music gets played. You don't like my decorations, my food, or my music, get the hell out. This is it's one thing if you're a reporter, but it's another thing if you're in the space that you've carved out for yourself. It's take it or leave it, basically. Not that I won't apologize if I think I go over the line, but what's the great Sam Waterston's great line from the newsroom in the first episode? He tells Jeff Daniels, "I'm too old to be afraid of dumb people." That's pretty much what I am. But I got in the romance of newspapers very, very young. I just, we got 2 newspapers a day at my house, a morning and an evening paper. I would dive to beat my parents for them. When I was in college, I worked at part-time at the Milwaukee Sentinel on the sports desk, typing. I was typing bowling agate, bowling scores, which is a very important beat in Milwaukee. 61% of the adult population in Milwaukee belongs to bowling leagues, and very few people in Milwaukee who bowl are named Smith. So I got real good at abbreviating. But in any event, I just loved being around the newsroom. This was back when we were still sending copy up on pneumatic tubes and stuff. Mm-hmm. I just, you walk through the press room and you smell the ink, and I just think the romance of it just, it would always overwhelm me. When I was at the Phoenix, for most of the time there, it was just the same. We didn't have computers until my last year, 1983, my last year there. I mean, we were all typewriters and, paper and
Smoke-filled room?
only if George Kimball was there. We had a bunch. We were very lefty paper. People were down on smoking, not down on drinking though. The Elliott Lounge across the street was the auxiliary newsroom.
Wait, there was drinking in Boston?
Oh yes.
I'm shocked.
Believe it or not, yeah. I mean, everybody. I mean, it was, and the Elliott was a great place. Nobody even looked up the night the horse came in.
Oh, very nice.
But I mean, again, you go right back to Deadline USA. That's I can't remember what the name of the bar is that they have the lake in, but that's what the Elliott was like. You get in there, you'd argue about stories, you'd curse out the editors behind their backs. And it was just what Bogart talks about when he talks about the importance of a newspaper, both at the beginning of the movie and in the courtroom scene, is the way I've always felt. A daily newspaper is of critical importance to any city, anywhere. I mean, the format and platforms may change, but the tribe needs its stories told to it every day. And if we ever lose that, we've lost a lot.
Well, there's no shortage of news films that we could have chosen, and of course we're talking about and even going to things, say maybe if we go as far out as say something like The Wire. The fifth season of The Wire is very much rooted in news. I think what David Simon himself was a journalist, was he not?
The last season of The Wire, with the budget cuts and the dying, egregious, kind of seriously ill Baltimore Sun, and the Pulitzer hungry young reporter who makes the stuff up, and Gus, the city editor who won't let him do it, and he fights with the editor and the publisher who are only in it for the revenue. I mean, that's Deadline USA, except it's in the 1990s. It's the same thing.
Well, people tend to talk about The Wire in these glowing terms in the first 4 seasons, and then kind of talk about that.
They don't. Yeah, a lot of people don't like the season. Don't like the season that was concentrated on the public schools, and they really don't like the season that concentrated on the newspaper. I love the newspaper.
I did too. I'm a season 2 guy. Actually, my favorite is season 2. And I'm a McNulty diehard till I die. I absolutely love McNulty's character because he's so.
It ends with him awake. It ends with awake, and my favorite character, Bunk Johnson, singing the Pogues in a bar. Yeah. How great is that?
No, it's perfect.
Pop bars and newspaper bars are, first of all, a lot of them are the same thing, and a lot of them the same places, but they're roughly the same thing.
This is the entry to a world that I don't even know existed.
I mean, when I worked for the Boston Herald, there's a place down the street called J.J. Foley's, and it was one of the first 2 or 3 places to get its licenses back after Prohibition in Boston. And it was run at this point by the grandson of the original J.J. Foley, and it was both a newspaper and a cop bar. And I went down there. One week early on at the Herald, I forgot to go to the credit union and cash my paycheck. So Peter Gelsinis, the great Cityside columnist at the Herald, took me down to Foley's, and he introduced me to Mr. as we called him, Mr. Foley, the older Foley. And he said, just sign your check and Mr. Foley will cash it. And so I did, and he did. And he took the cash out of this bulging, bank envelope with the zipper. And I turned to Peter and I said, how does this place never get robbed? I mean, because everybody went in there and got all the press guys would go in there at 4 a.m. and cash their checks. And Peter looked around the room and he pointed at people and went, cop, 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 undercover cop. He said, if you came in here and said, this is a stick up, you'd get as far as this is, and you'd be dead in a hail of police bullets, and nobody would have seen anything. So that was, like I said, a lot of cop bars and newspaper bars used to be the same thing. I always said that, like, my favorite newspaper movie is His Girl Friday. The best movie about reporting is All the President's Men. The best movie about newspapers is Deadline USA. Not all of us have brought down a president, and not all of us are as quick-witted as Rosalind Russell and Cary Grant. But most of us have experienced the death or dying of a newspaper. And so that's what touches me most about Deadline USA. Now, I understand it's not. I mean, it's certainly not an A-list movie. The mobster character of Martin Gable is written, it's almost transparent. It's so thin. But the scenes in the newsroom, the guy who comes up to him in the bar and wants to, be a foreign correspondent, and Bogey quizzes him on whether he knows Arabic and stuff, and then puts him to work on the rewrite desk on the lobster shift. The veteran woman crime reporter who knows where all the bodies are buried. The sports guy who, they find out the paper's closing in 2 days, and he turns to the one of the city editors and says, "It's still a sports page to put out."
I love that line.
Yeah, and then of course Jim Backus is Jim Cleary, the gossip columnist, and they all put themselves together to put out this great final edition that brings down the mobster. But the great thing about the movie is that the newspaper folds anyway. That's the truth. The truest part of the movie is when the light goes out at the top of the building, right at the end, the last shot.
Yeah, it's a question of, in a lot of ways, it's actually in a lot of ways this introspective line. Like, we've got no reason to be doing this, but we do it anyway because this is who we are. Am I right?
Exactly. It's an indication of what drives people to and keeps people in a business that can be very unrewarding in terms of stability and certainly financial. I mean, it just you become what you write, and if you're lucky, you hang on to that. And I think that probably the best quality newspaper movie is probably Spotlight.
Spotlight's tough to beat.
And not just because I know everybody, the real people in that movie. I know all of them. In fact, when they go downstairs to the library in the Mock Globe newsroom, they go down the spiral staircase. My office is the one in the background of the spiral staircase.
Are you serious?
Michael Resendez, the guy Mark Ruffalo played, he and I started. He and I started the Boston Phoenix the same day. We worked. I've known Michael for 45 years. I testified in a libel suit on behalf of Walter Robinson, Michael Keaton's character. And Sasha Pfeiffer, I got to know when I was working there. The 9 years I was working there, and she then moved over to WBUR. And I'll tell you an interesting story about Sasha. Sasha was driving this all took place in 1991, 92. She was driving a new, I think it was a Nova, Chevy Nova, that she was still driving at the Globe when I met her. And they wanted the car to look period. So they brought it to Hollywood, and she essentially got a brand new Nova. They rebuilt it. It was great. And she texted me from the auditorium at the Oscars. I texted her and I said, "What are you wearing?" And she said, "Ann and Hope," which is a department store here. No, that's an extraordinarily well done movie. Matt Carroll and I, the guy who's does all the spreadsheets, he and I worked at the Herald together for 5 years. So yeah, it was so fun. And I actually ran into Ruffalo at one of the Democratic debates in 2016. He's a big he does a lot of water protection and stuff. So he was there.
He's really big into that.
Spinning for that. And I went up to him and I introduced myself and I told him about Michael. And I said, I don't know how many people are qualified to tell you this, but you nailed that motherfucker. Oh, he really did. Oh my God. Falling out with his wife and living in the apartment in East Boston and running to the, jogging for exercise and winding up at the office on Saturday or Sunday. Oh man, Michael's a tiger. He's an adult dose, but a wonderful guy and one of my best friends.
I thought for certain you'd actually say Spotlight was the film you wanted to do when we were talking about what to do before you. And I'm glad you chose Deadline USA. I don't want to watch Spotlight ever again. And I think it is a amazing film. It's too goddamn hard to watch.
Yeah, it was apparently, obviously I've talked to all the real people. It was a goddamn hard story to report. It really took it out of folks.
You live with it.
Well, not just that, but it was lying on the ground like the treasure of Sierra Madre for 20 years before Marty Barron, who had no connection to Boston, shows up one day and says, "Wait a minute, This is a fuck of a good story. Where are you people? I mean, the first story on the first real the priest they caught, Father Porter, down in Fall River, was written by a woman named Kristen Lombardi at the Boston Phoenix. And then, I'm like, this is real. You're going to think I live in Dogpatch. A few years after that, Andy Zellman who was one of my editors at the Phoenix, was the editor of the Globe magazine, and she ran a story about Porter and maybe Gagan, one of the 2 or 3 of the first ones, and the Cardinal Law called the editor of the Globe at the time, a devout Catholic and Notre Dame grad named Matt Storin, and literally brought down the wrath of God on him. And Storin came storming down the aisle and threw a copy of that week's magazine in Andy's face. And that was the incident that pretty much killed the Globe's interest in that story until Marty showed up. But it was just there. I mean, at the end of the movie, when they start talking about why didn't we have this, there's no good reason why nobody had it, because it was, like I said, it was the treasure of Sierra Madre. There was gold just lying on top of the ground. Nobody wanted to pick it up. But I agree in terms of both storytelling, acting, and technical achievement. Spotlight's as good as it gets. It deserved every Oscar it got.
We did that on HATM early on. Did you tweet along that night? I can't recall if you did or not, because I know you've tweeted along a few times when you've done it.
I went off Twitter for a while. Esquire banjaxed my Twitter account. I couldn't get back on for a while, but now I do.
I think you know this. I tried to quit HATM a few different times, and I kept being
told
by everybody else,
no,
you're not allowed.
Are you kidding? But this is not HATM. This is not HATM, right? This is your podcast. This is the HATM podcast.
Yeah, it's the HATM podcast. It's the next thing because, and I've told the story a couple of times, but I'll just, fuck it. We're talking about Spotlight and all this other shit. I was in a real shitty spot last year when I was going through a breakup with this woman I was just incredibly head over heels about. And she was like, yeah, I'm on to the next story, if you will. And I was like, fuck it. We're closing shop. And everybody said, no, you can't do that. But in order to, after 4 years, I felt like we had to do something different. And it had to grow and do something. And I really wanted this pod to be maybe a different take on film, where we could sit down and kind of play with it and kind of talk about these movies and the history behind them in maybe a different way than the Sunday night thing, So I mean, like now we get to have these conversations, So that was why, and now, and I'll tell you, I was hesitant because I thought podcasts. I'm another white guy with a podcast, It's like it was going to be cliche. It was going to be cliche.
Well, as long as you diversify your guests, what do you care?
I try. That's the thing that's really difficult. And I'll tell you, and here's the other thing, right? One of the reasons why I'm actually having to go back past historians to talk to folks is that so many folks, it's like, and I've always been adamant about this as far as like the movies that we cover on Sunday nights. I always want to make this a wide array of films that are, starring men, women, people of color, American stories, non-American stories, drama, comedies, all the shit. The way that the historical field has laid itself out is it's largely dominated by white men. And so I'm having to really push myself to find other folks to talk to. And that's not always easy because there's labor involved with people having to set aside their family time, their scholarly time, whatever, to do this pod for a couple hours, or maybe to go watch the movie. And there's another couple of hours. And then you sit down and do this. And this is a famously nonprofit enterprise right now, So, I wanted to diversify, start talking to more and more folks. And that was part of the, you're here because we've been friends for a while, but that's the thing that's constantly in my mind.
I know it's funny because I'm later this week. There's a guy in Ohio who's doing podcasts with sports writers of my generation, talking about their careers. And I've listened to I must have listened to 8 or 9 of them now, and it's terrific. I mean, there's a lot to be said for the archival elements of podcasting, I think, if you do it well.
Well, it's another way of interrogating. You were talking about your career as a journalist, right? And we draw these lines: journalist, historian, blah blah blah. And I like to call journalists real-time historians. That's the way I've always kind of interpreted that role. I mean,
Well, one turn of the dial, and I could have wound up as getting a master's or a doctorate in history. That was going to be the alternative, because I just devour it. You can't see any books in my shop, but they're all over here, and over there, and over there.
Sorry, you can't see any books here either because they're all in books upstairs. They're all in boxes upstairs from the movie.
Yeah, I've got a ton of boxes in my office, the other end of the house. Yeah, I just I got started. One of my favorite books as a child was a book called. My father brought it back from the high school where he was teaching at the time. It's an old book, an old classics textbook called Myths and Their Meaning. In fact, I just saw another copy of it on eBay. I read it over and over again because the stories were great. I mean, guys turning into trees and women turning into fountains and the Trojan War and Cyclops. These are great stories for kids, and that's what got me started. I think on my my love for history is I wanted to know the people who told these stories. Achilles is a great story. Who told the story first, or how did it get to be told the way it's told now? And then you start going down the trail like that, and eventually you come through revolutionary history and Civil War history. And I mean, I wasn't taught any European history. I was in Catholic school, and European history in Catholic school at the time. This is why I get a big kick out of the textbook wars that are going on now. European history ends at the French Revolution and doesn't pick up again until World War One, pretty much. And nothing about the Eastern Bloc, nothing about the history of Russia and Europe, nothing about Scandinavia, a little bit about the causes of World War One, but not enough. And we didn't even learn a lot about the popes, for God's sake. It was a survey of a survey. And so when I find out that people are fighting to keep kids in middle school and high school from learning about stuff they wouldn't otherwise get from a survey of a survey, I get very mad. I mean, we're raising a generation of historical illiterates.
Did you see what's going on in Missouri with the state senators?
Yeah, but now I'm hearing that I'm hearing there weren't really books.
Oh, really?
The Snopes did a thing. Apparently, it was just book boxes. I mean, the symbolism is still awful. The image is still references back to a really bad time in history. But apparently, there were no actual books were injured in the making of this film.
Can I tell you, I've actually burned a book before.
Have you really?
Oh yeah, I burned one book. It was a piece of shit, and I literally needed fire starter. It was you're gonna laugh when I tell you which one it was. It's Hillbilly Elegy.
And you made barbecue out of it. Hey, that's a good part. I mean, I can't think of a better. I mean, unless you were cooking meth.
J.D. Vance fucking kills me. I call him Pander Bear because that's what he looks like to me. He looks like a.
Well, he's gone.
I mean, he's gone so hard.
Yeah, I know, and he wasn't in a great place to start with. He was a fake to start with, but now he's a complete. Now he's a fake on many levels.
Seems to be a lot of that right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going on. Again, getting back to Deadline USA at the beginning of the movie, when Bogart has just found out that the newspaper is going to close, and the mayor tries to get a hold of him, and he first of all he says, "Darn the mayor," because you couldn't say "damn" in those days in 1952, and then he says, "The mayor." He only wants to know if the new paper will support him for re-election. Mm-hmm. That's exactly right.
Well, there's a spot where the mayor's calling, Bogey's just storming out of the room. He's like, "I'll deal with this later," I want to talk about Bogart here.
Okay.
Bogart. This film comes out in 1952. Bogart dies in 1957. I think he's 56 when he dies. He's a young man when he dies.
He had throat cancer. Yeah, I mean it's booze and cigarettes. All those cigarettes he smoked in Casablanca.
Does he smoke in this film? I'm trying to recall.
Kim Hunter does,
right?
And a couple of guys at the bar do, and the guy whose sister got murdered, the pug who gets shot in the press room, he smokes a lot. and drinks a lot. And of course, they pay him for his story, which is, you know, paper's going out of business. What the hell's the difference? Yeah, there's some smoking, but I don't think Bogart does.
It's the rare film where he doesn't,
Yeah.
And one of the things I was paying attention to, because, I've actually never had a cigarette. And I've always kind of been fascinated by smoking on film. I enjoy a cigar, but I've literally, I'm from Kentucky. I'm literally wearing a Kentucky shirt right now.
I saw that. I saw the Big Blue Nation.
I'm literally having some tobacco shipped from Kentucky right now to Colorado for my job, tobacco leaves. But, everybody where I grew up smoked. And you see it in film now. There's this differentiation in the 1950s when people smoked. It wasn't a marker of like some sort of moral quandary, this moral ambiguousness. Like you see it in a film now. If a person is a smoker, there's an edge to this person. There's something. 1950s. This was same as drinking a Diet Coke. Am I wrong? I mean, this was just what you did.
My father, they gave packs and packs of cigarettes to guys going overseas in World War II. My father smoked until about 1965, and then he quit. My mother smoked like a chimney till the day she died, and she lived to be almost 90. But it killed my grandfather, one of my grandfathers. But it was always around. Bars, my God, somebody lights up in a bar now, and it's like somebody lit off a smoke bomb. I can't remember before about 8 or 10 years ago. I can't remember a bar I ever walked out of where I wasn't reeking of tobacco smoke. And I've never smoked a cigarette in a day in my life.
There's another thing going on here with this film. The entire cast is white. Everybody in this film is white. And I'm kind of wondering if that's indicative of what newspaper staffs looked like in the 1950s. If there was a change, do we see that? What's the racial demographic now of reporters? Does that change at all over time, or what happens?
It's better than none.
Sure.
By the way, there are no black reporters in Spotlight either.
No.
And I know there were black people working at the Globe then. No, I think it's a legitimate criticism of any movie made about or in a city in the 1950s. Hell, Woody Allen does movies about New York all the time with no black people in them. Of course, he's got other problems.
A little bit.
Yeah. I take your point. I mean, I think the problem is if they did put a black person in Deadline USA, he would be a janitor or, a dishwasher in the bar or a cab driver. Would that have been better? Yeah, probably. But if these are movies you like, you have to go with the time they're made.
Yeah, that's the reason why it becomes an artifact. Does it not? The fact that you're seeing like in 1952, people are making films exclusively about white people, and I'm curious.
I think the fact that there are two women in positions of great influence.
Yeah,
actually 3 if you count Kim Hunter. But the crime reporter and the director of research. Well, the librarian, the collective research, the librarian's probably fairly true to the time, but having a woman crime reporter in 1952, that would have been a rare thing.
With Bogey here in this film, he's like I said, a little bit later. Where do you cast him as far as your favorite roles? I want to come back to Bogey just real quick.
Well, I think there's a director named Michael Curtiz. He directed Casablanca, but he also, I'm discovering, thank God, thank you, Turner Classic Movies. I mean, he directed so many movies that I love. He directed Captain Blood. He directed The Seahawk. He directed a very weird John Wayne football movie called Trouble Along the Way. He created the Bogart that I love. My first movie that I ever saw with Bogart was not Casablanca. It was Action in the North Atlantic, about the convoys in World War II. And he played the first mate on a Liberty ship. And my dad and I watched it because my father's job in the first 2.5 years of World War II was as the chief of a U.S. Navy gun crew on Liberty ships doing convoy duty in the North Atlantic. So he sat me down and we watched it, and he didn't really get tense about it. But the most interesting thing about that movie, besides the fact that Raymond Massey and Bogart and the rest of the cast, what's his name, Alan Hale Sr., the father of the skipper on Gilligan's Island, is in it. They're going to Murmansk, and they get to Murmansk, and they're greeted by these overjoyed on the dock crowd of Russians, and the Russians are helping them pull the battered old Liberty ship into the dock, and the women are waving at the crew, and they're yelling, comrade, comrade, and two of the crewmen on the ship are standing next to each other, and one says, "Comrade, what's that mean?" And the other guy says, "That means friend. That's good." And this is a movie made, in the midst of World War II when we were allies. But then I went back to the credits, and the screenplay was written by a guy named John Howard Lawson, who was one of the Hollywood 10. He was blacklisted screenwriter, and I always wondered whether or not it was that scene that got him blacklisted.
Got him in trouble.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The Soviet Air Force saves the ship, and then they come in and all these, happy Russians.
All right, that actually gets it to a point here that I don't think you can talk about this film without talking about the Red Scare. This film comes out in 1952. The big bad here, well, there are two big bads, right? There's the newspaper that's buying the newspaper, but then there's also the mob.
Mobbed up unions, which was a big deal.
How do we see this film in terms of the Red Scare?
I politically, it's pretty untouched by the Red Scare.
Yeah.
There was red baiting used in the pursuit of mobbed up unions. There's no question. Bobby Kennedy wasn't one of his finer hours. Basically it was the beginning of a spate of movies. It was part of the spate of movies that included On the Waterfront, where corrupt unions and mobbed up unions became the bogeyman in films. That's certainly the mainspring of the plot here, is that this guy Rienzi, the mob boss, he's got his fingers in everything. He owns judges. He manipulates the legislative hearing at the beginning of the movie. He's obviously into booze and he's into boxing. He's into. He's
a great guy.
Yeah, he's everywhere.
Booze and
the sports writer says, "Well, Rienzi's into the fight game, that's for sure." So maybe he's Frank Costello. Who knows? But I don't see a lot of Red Scare in it. I don't see a lot of McCarthyite influence in it. I see a lot of perilously close to every union is corrupt, but not quite falling over the line. But basically, I think it's in a movie. In a lot of ways, it's a condemnation of newspaper capitalism, when money has become all that matters, and voices are silenced.
That brings me to my next question here, and I feel like maybe one of the things we've already talked about might be an answer to it. If you take this film and situate it now, 71 years later, what does this movie look like set in 2023?
Well, a lot of computers. Actually, there was a movie a few years ago called State of Play with Russell Crowe and I think Rachel McAdams. And Rachel McAdams played a blogger on the newspaper where Russell Crowe was the Cityside columnist. I think Helen Mirren played the Katharine Graham figure. That didn't have the element of the newspaper folding that Deadline USA does. But it was sort of, the same dynamic in that, Russell Crowe was a guy hanging on by his fingernails to a job that, possibly he's being obsoleted in. But right now, you're probably talking about maybe a newspaper in a small town in Oklahoma that's been doing great work, or maybe Storm Lake, Iowa, who won a Pulitzer for editorial writing, and it gets bought up by a hedge fund, or it gets bought up by venture capitalists, and then sold off for parts to whoever, whether it's another chain that will bust it up even further, or if it's just sold off for parts and closed. The difference is you would have venture capital and hedge funds involved in killing the newspaper, more so than I think another chain.
We talk a lot in history about the best, the worst, things like that. And I'm always hesitant when people say, "Oh, things were so much better then, so much better back when," because you can. And one of my favorite things people say, "Oh, the kids these days," right? And people are always complaining about the youths forever, right? But I'm kind of wondering if we could talk for a second about Fox and what Fox News has kind of done to journalism. Is Fox been the driving force behind the change in journalism? Like, how do we quantify what Fox is or Fox News is in the current era of media?
Yeah, I think it knocked the other cable stations and network news back on their heels for 5 or 6 years. What was this, unknown beast who showed up? I think first of all, Roger Ailes is dead. Thank you, God. And, Rupert's on the way out.
Kissinger's still alive.
That if anything will make me finally throw me into atheism, it's the fact that that's 50. He's managed to live 50 years after the Chilean coup. Anyway, I think the media that really changed everything was when the Fairness Doctrine collapsed and conservatives saw the potential of AM talk radio before the liberals did and cornered that market. Not just Limbaugh, but all the mini Limbaughs in every city who came on after Rush. Charlie Sykes, who's now, supposed to be an ally. And, people up in Boston, Howie Carr up in Boston. I think Fox was the logical extension of that, was the television creature of that particular medium. Now, I think history will bear me out on this, I think liberals grabbed the same advantage on the internet. And I think conservatives have been playing catch up on the internet the same way liberals have been playing catch up on talk radio and TV. That's just my opinion, but that's the way it feels to me anyway. But I think Fox is the video progeny of the outburst of conservative talk radio around the country. And now, of course, there are mini Foxes. There are Newsmax and America's Real Voice and You're All Pedophile TV or whatever.
Yeah, I mean they're like ultra foxes at this point.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely.
Super foxes or something like this.
Yeah.
You spoke a little bit earlier when you're talking about how long your day is. When you get up and you start looking at who's talking and things like that. When you get up and you start looking at the news or start looking at what's trending and so forth, who are you looking at? Like specifically, are there specific journalists or historians or commentators that you find are? Who do you like? Like people listening in here, I can't imagine anyone who's coming to us who don't follow some of the people you talk about. But who specifically do you find help move the needle?
And move my needle personally.
Yes, please. Yeah, yours specifically.
I think Margaret Sullivan, who's now writing for the Guardian, Jane Mayer, who's from the New Yorker, who's an absolute gift from God. My old Globe colleague Charlie Savage, who's written some of the most important breakthrough stories on the abuse of executive power, now over 3 administrations. Generally, the reporting staff of the New York Times can still do better work on all stories than just about any newspaper in the country, if they set their mind to it. I mean, I just linked to a story they did about the effect of climate change on this small town in Kansas, which is running out of water. The whole county is almost out of water, and people are going around with collection bottles, collecting the runoff from air conditioners because they need water, and which sounds like something out of Calcutta or London in the 1890s. They went out there, and the New York Times will spend the time and the money to do that. Now, do I have some problems with some of their political coverage? Yeah, same with the Washington Post. They are without question 1 and 1A now in terms of American newspapers. I mean, I will look and find cities. I mean, it's so hard because you're losing so many like local newspapers, local columnists, that it's hard to find one that you can count on for 2 or 3 times a week. I mean, I remember when the Daily News had Lars Eric Nelson and Stanley Crouch on the op-ed page every Wednesday, and I would buy the New York Daily News every Wednesday just because they were there. I think Josh Marshall does a great job with talking points. I think his success is proof enough of that. Other bloggers. I read Digby every day. I read No More Mr. Nice blog because he has an alphabetized blog list, which I find very convenient. I kick around the blogs. I kick around the newspaper websites. I kick around the network websites. But one of the real problems I have, and I back up from no one for the respect that I have for the people I mentioned, and I'm sure dozens of people that I haven't mentioned, is that the profession has gotten faceless. Who's the Royko? Who's the columnist who owns Chicago? Nobody. Who's the columnist that owns New York? Nobody.
Can I tell you, when I'm a kid in Western Kentucky in 1990, I'm 13 years old, I'm reading Mike Royko out of Chicago.
Of course. I mean, why would anybody not? I mean,
because the Murray Ledger and Times carried his column.
I mean, that son of a bitch wrote 4 days a week until he died. Do you know how many columnists in major newspapers write 4 days a week? None of them. Maureen Dowd writes 1 column a week. David Brooks writes 1 or maybe 2, and neither of them is worth reading. I think Jamel Bowie's another one that I really come to enjoy, and Michelle Goldberg. Those two saved the Times op-ed page for me. Michelle is she's been all over the Christian theocrat movement for. I mean, I read her book, which I believe is titled "With God on Our Side," before I ever read anything she'd written in at the Nation or now at the Times. But again, who's the Cityside columnist now? The legendary Cityside columnist who's going to leave a hole in the city when he leaves? There's nobody. That may be sentimentalized for me, but there's nobody in Boston. I can tell you that. And there's nobody, I don't know that there's one in Chicago. There's certainly not one in New York. Being a Cityside columnist is a lost art. I mean, Royko was a genius because he could make, teenagers in Western Kentucky care about, stuff that was happening in Chicago, just because he was a great writer. But I've just named several people who I immediately go to when I see the byline, and I'm sure there are more. I'm sure there are people on the West Coast that I'm forgetting to mention. But the profession of newspapering has become faceless. That's the one thing that the staff of the day in Deadline U.S.A. was not. Every cop knew who Willebrand was. Every, showgirl knew who Jim Cleary was. All the sports guys, the sports editor finds the thug because he knows a lot of people in the boxing world. They're all part of the life of that city. I've spent my entire life, by the way, trying to figure out what city it is, and I can't. But sometimes I think it's New York. Sometimes I think it's Albany. Sometimes I think it's Baltimore. I can never figure out what city it is. It's certainly on the East Coast somewhere, but that's not the way it is now. And part of it I think is the requirements that young journalists face when they come into the business. One of the great things about working in newspapers was the ability to hang around, swap lies, trade ideas, hang around the newsroom, roll up balls of rubber cement and throw them at people, and just hang out together, or go to a bar after a game or after a political event and sit down with other reporters or activists or political staffers, and you have a couple of beers and you talk about life. Nobody does that anymore. I went almost 30 years without being on a political campaign. I did not go on one. I went on one my last one at the Phoenix was 1983. My first one at the Esquire blog was 2012. So I check into the Marriott Hotel in downtown Des Moines. It's January, it's snowing. And I walk in and I go to the bar and I see all these people who are, infinitely, years younger than me. They're all clearly reporters. Some of them are still wearing the credentials around their neck, which is rule number one. You never wear a credential to the bar. My dear young man, it simply is not done. But they're all tweeting. And then I go to a ballpark, and God, the best place in the world to hang around while you were working was a press box at a ballpark, and all the young sports writers are tweeting out Verdugo grounded out to second, so they'll have a tweet up that their bosses will see. I mean, no wonder people get jaded. No wonder people get burned out at a young age in this profession now. You're not allowed to have a personality, and you basically, and I use this word only in the most derisive way possible. You're basically a content provider. You might as well be delivering shrimp to a restaurant. I didn't get into this business to provide content. I got into this business to tell stories, to write stories. That's what I do. I think I would have been a real ornament to the staff of the day. Of course, I'd be out of work now.
You mentioned 2012. Mitt Romney just says he's getting out. What am I to think of Romney? I myself can't draw a beat on this guy. I've always felt disappointed when I think about Mitt Romney.
Well, that's been the primary product of his political career. I was under his barely distinguishable leadership in Massachusetts for 2 terms.
Right.
The one thing to remember about Mitt Romney is he has absolutely no political principles at all. There is nothing that he would jeopardize an ounce of influence or a dime of profit by taking a stand. I mean, this guy was in 2008. This guy was going to be the Republican with a health care plan because of what he managed to accomplish with Ted Kennedy's help and the help of the Massachusetts legislature. The problem was, the more people got to know him, the less they liked him. So along comes 2012, and Obamacare has become the bogeyman, and he runs away from the one unalloyed achievement of his political career, which is getting health care to people who didn't have it. I mean, the system in Massachusetts is not great, but it was never politically unpopular. And all you have to know about him is there's a official portrait of every governor of Massachusetts in the State House. And the most recent one is in the governor's actual office. When Romney had his portrait painted, when he left the governorship, his portrait, he had a hand on a white book with a caduceus on it, to remind people of his health care plan. Before he ran in 2012, he had the painter come in and paint out the book.
Are you shitting me?
No.
Spineless.
Deval Patrick, his successor, pointed that out to me.
I think that the damning thing for Romney, for me, as a complete outsider, and I wasn't following him up politically, is tightly, but he comes into the Senate and he's senator during Trump's presidency. And yeah, he voted during the impeachment stuff, but just radio silence during the Trump presidency. All the opportunities he had to speak, just nothing.
Well, that's the destructive hypnosis that overcame all of them. And then the ones who really hated Trump quit rather than stay in. There were a couple of them who were radically opposed to Trump, but rather than run for re-election against a Trump-backed candidate, they just left.
Kinzinger I liked.
Well, Kinzinger's one of them. Yeah, but he was in the House, but they redistricted him too. I mean, he had absolutely no chance of being re-elected. I might have run anyway, just to make the noise. But it will take historians at the movies in 2315 to figure out this particular time in our history. I mean, I know that my history reading tells me that there are political parties that disappear because, history catches up with them, like the Whigs, or all of their people die, like the Federalists, and, because they were products of a particular time in history, like the Know-Nothings. I can't come up with a major political party in this country that endangered its existence by losing its freaking mind. The Republican Party is insane right now. I mean, I refer to it on the blog as the prion disease. You eat the monkey brains and, 5 years later, you don't remember your name. That's what's going on with them. They can't move a first-term senator out of the way so we can get, the Joint Chiefs of Staff manned. I mean, no Republican would ever do that before. That's just crazy.
Is that a sign of McConnell's of McConnell falling from grace here as far as his inability to move Tuberville around?
Well, I don't know. I think it may be. I think it may be a sign that his energy is winding down. I mean,
Yeah.
it was. I mean, ask the Democrats when Lyndon Johnson was majority leader whether or not a majority leader could punish you. Ask Nancy Pelosi. What happens when you get challenged for your office? You can do it if you want to, and if you have the energy and the fight in you to do it. But
Nancy's running again, so she's
well, look at the Republican side. The president pro tem of the Senate is Chuck Grassley. He's 300 years old, and you had Ben Sasse, who was going to be the link to the youth. He bailed in a hurry, and now he's wrecking the University of Florida.
Well, the whole system in Florida is going to shit. So yeah,
he got out of the Senate as fast as he could. Ted Cruz is now basically a podcaster. I don't know.
To be fair, so am I.
Well, no, but you don't have a paycheck coming out of my pocket.
No. In fact, I should actually run for senator of Texas. Maybe I can be the one to dislike.
You have a much better beard.
I like to think so. I've got a much better everything.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we all do.
It's a frustrating moment. I remember thinking the Tea Party was batshit crazy, and we've gone well beyond Tea Party at this point in time.
Well, what you've got, and I was warning about this when I first started the blog. You have to watch the state legislatures because that's the farm team. That's where the next generation of congressmen are coming from. So now you've got Tea Party people who were elected from the wilds of the Tea Party, moved up the ladder to the House and occasionally into the Senate, and you wound up with a political party that is driven by these guys. And of course, then the absolute ideal presidential candidate falls in their lap and empowers them in all their worst instincts, and empowers, to be honest with you, the American voter in all the American voter's worst instincts. I mean, this has been a long time coming. This is why I am impatient occasionally with our never Trump allies, because these were people in positions of influence in the Republican Party who could have stopped this, or at least tried to. Michael Steele had no problem with the Tea Party when he was national chairman. Charlie Sykes was Rush Limbaugh in Milwaukee. I mean, he's more responsible than any other media figure for the disaster that Scott Walker and the Republicans have made of Wisconsin's politics. I mean, and of course, this all goes down the memory hole because, we're all against Trump now. A lot of them, I don't think, have made amends for enabling the process that produced what we have today. The only one I'll exempt from that is Stuart Stevens, who wrote a book saying, hey, it started with Reagan and I didn't see it coming. And God bless him for that, because he's right. It was Reagan who married Goldwater conservatism to the religious right. It was Reagan who brought in freaky deaky economics, which the Republicans can't get rid of. They can't untie themselves from supply side economics, which is a disaster and always fails. And it just snowballed from there. There were fits and starts. One of the few good things I can say about Bill Clinton's 2 terms is he kept the wolves at bay, by and large. He gave in on a lot of issues that the wolves wanted, which is why I don't give him a whole lot of credit. But, we need more Hutchinsons in the media to hold these people accountable. We need more Jim Clearys out there interviewing showgirls, and we need more Willebrands on the political beat.
The maddening, frustrating thing for me is to see that Biden is quietly having the single best first-term presidency since, FDR at this point in time, and he's running neck and neck in the polls with Trump for a re-election thing, and I'm just like, where's the failure to get this message out?
It is, and while I'm as critical as anybody of the Democratic messaging woes, a lot of it is this business. A lot of this is my business. I mean, a lot of this is both siderism. It's an inability to call authoritarianism what it is to its face. It's an inability to confront the very real danger that's in our politics now. If January 6th didn't shake them out of their lethargy, I don't know what has to. Everything Donald Trump says is a lie. Everything. Unless you're willing to take that as axiomatic of your coverage of him, you're not doing anybody any good. You're not doing doing the electorate any good. You're not doing the profession any good. You're not doing the country any good. Everything he says is a lie. Everything. And I don't care how many people believe it. And I don't care where he stands in the polls. Everything he says is a lie. If that hasn't been demonstrated clearly enough to the people who are political editors in this country, I don't know what he has to do.
I want to come back to Deadline USA. We talk about this movie eerily, presciently forecasting the future, a sign of its time in 1952. You talked about some other films that you really liked as far as about the newsroom, including The Newsroom, the series. What are the movies you like when it comes to talking about journalism? We talked a little bit about some of these other things like Spotlight and so forth.
Well, the most entertaining one is His Girl Friday with Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell, which is, dialogue that, makes Aaron Sorkin look like William Faulkner.
Oh, really?
I mean, fast. And of course, it's a remake of the classic newspaper play and movie, The Front Page, that was written by Ben Hecht and Charles MacArthur, both of whom were Chicago newspapermen. Except in His Girl Friday, the editor and the reporter, who the editor tries to get to stay as a woman, and his ex-wife. But the two of them, it's on Turner Classic Movies once every 2 or 3 months. And watching him manipulate her and her turn into, this fire bell reporter. I can't explain the whole situation, but in the middle, right at the end of the movie, she's writing the big story about this escaped prisoner, and he's talking to his desk, and he's going through, we've got the exclusive, and he starts talking to the city editor, and he says, no, put the European, not the hell with the European war. He says, and then he says, no, leave the rooster story. That's human interest. And then he starts fuming, and he says, take Hitler and stick him on the funny pages, which is maybe my favorite newspaper line of all time. And also His Girl Friday has one of the great shout outs in the history of motion pictures. Actually, a couple of them. Ralph Bellamy plays the editor's ex-wife, the hotshot reporter, her fiance that she's allegedly going to marry. And he's played by Ralph Bellamy. And the editor hires a thug to kidnap him. And the thug says, well, what does he look like? And the editor says, he looks like that guy in the movies, Ralph Bellamy. Very metal. And then he's talking to the sheriff, and the sheriff threatens him. And he says, it's Cary Grant. He says, the last person to say that to me was Archie Leach before he cut his throat. And that's Cary Grant's real name. That is the most enjoyable and the most entertaining newspaper movie of all time. I kind of liked the one with Paul Newman and Sally Field, Absence of Malice.
I was wondering when we were going to get to Newman.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a pretty good. I think that was pretty accurate and a pretty good movie, and kind of a really a cautionary tale about the price of ambition. I love the paper. I mean, I adore the paper, except for the crisis pregnancy part, but everything else about it. I mean, that scene in Michael Keaton's office where everybody's at him at once, and Randy Quaid. By the way, the last really good role Randy Quaid did before he went completely bananas.
Wasted time.
Where he comes in, shoots the gun, and that is so perfect. And of course, the great scene with Spalding Gray and Michael Keaton, where Spalding Gray, you just lost your chance to cover the world, and Michael Keaton says, I don't live in the world. I live in fucking New York City, so go fuck yourself. And he slams the phone down. I think my favorite moment in that movie, though, is when they're going to replay with the scoop they got about the two kids. And Michael Keaton is down in the press room, and he's running up the stairs to replay the issue. And Randy Quaid says, aren't you going to say it? And Michael Keaton says, what are you talking about? He says, you can't do it and not say it. And Michael Keaton goes, stop the presses. That won my heart, believe me.
All right, let me bring you back to the big question of the night then.
Okay.
Is Deadline U.S.A. a history movie?
Yes, it's a particular slice of history, and it's a particular slice of history that's repeating itself, uh, which is unfortunate. But yes, I think it's. I mean, first of all, it's got Ethel Barrymore in it. If you've got a Barrymore in your movie who isn't Drew, that's a piece of history. Okay, Ethel freaking Barrymore as the matriarch of the widow of the owner who's getting the newspaper sold out from under her by her ungrateful daughters. Uh, so that's history. But I think it's a particular slice of frightening oncoming obsolescence. I don't know how many people in 1952 who worked at newspapers watched it and identified with it. I'm sure some did. But I know that for people of my generation, it's a touchstone. I can come up with a half a dozen people who can quote you, Bogey's last line. It's the press, baby. Nothing you can do to stop it. He holds the receiver up to the phone, holds it into the press room, and the mob boss says, "What's that noise? What's that racket?" And he says, "That's the press, baby. The press. And there's nothing you can do about it." I mean, how can you not? And then they cut to the light, and the light goes out in the tower, and the newspaper's dead.
Yeah.
So it stopped, but the mob boss couldn't stop it.
It's a hell of a last punch.
Yeah, it really is. And then you find out when he's taking the ride with the mob boss that Bogey's character won 2 Pulitzers, and he's the managing editor of a dying newspaper.
It's a sad story. It's gosh, I'm probably making metaphors here at this point in time because it's too much with Bogey. At 52, he's got 5 years left. Is he dying yet? Does he know? I mean, the cancer's probably started at that point in time.
Yeah, I don't know that. I know he made movies when he was very ill. I don't think this was one of them. I mean, The African Queen was 1951, and I can't believe he would go if he was had terminal cancer. He would go in the jungle with John Huston, and
that's fair.
And Katharine Hepburn. In fact, there's a great movie about the filming of that movie called, I can't remember it, but it's about like Bogart and John Huston running amok in the jungles in the Congo. John Huston, by the way, was a piece of work. There, you talk about when you're dying. He directed literally a month before he died, hooked up in a wheelchair to an oxygen bottle. He directed the most beautiful film of James Joyce's short story, The Dead, that I've ever seen. The best, costume drama I've ever seen with his daughter Angelica and primarily an Irish cast. But it's just, it will kill you. And it practically killed him. He's dead. He was dead within the month. I'm surprised I don't know of any really good Fleet Street movies. And I wish I did. I don't know any really good, British newspaper movies. And I wish I did because that's a hell of a culture over there.
Yeah, the last newspaper film we did on HATM was actually Newsies.
Really?
Yeah.
No, they had one a couple of years ago. It wasn't really a newspaper film per se, about the woman who leaked the cables that became the Downing Street papers. And it was Rachel Weisz was in it, and I saw it in Washington. And it was a pretty good film. I think I was one of like 12 people who saw it. But a newspaper plays a big role in that, obviously. But I mean, the wildness of Fleet Street culture, it would seem to me, would be a gold mine for filmmakers. And I'm not aware of any British, especially British comedies. I'm not aware of any British comedies that took that on. And I'm and if people see this podcast and want to recommend it, please do. I think one of the historians at the movies will know. I have faith.
Our crew is wide at this point in time. We're on the verge of global takeover at something, I'm sure.
Certainly global domination.
I'm easily corruptible. I'm hoping so.
I'm looking forward to the Empress Joanne Freeman's reign. I think it will be one of peace and prosperity.
She is our queen. So yeah, I'm fine with that. So hey, where can people find you online? I'm assuming people already know, but where can find
you can find me on Twitter at Charles capital C P capital P Pierce Pierce. You can find me at Esquire.com every day. on my blog
every day,
except the weekends. We take weekends off, and occasionally on Defector, where I'm getting to do some sports writing, and it's a great bunch of people, and I'm very happy to be doing that.
I love it, man. I am so happy that you made the time for us tonight because I've
Hey,
for a while.
If I can get 5 more people to watch Deadline USA, my time here on Earth has been well spent.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of Movies podcast. Thank you so much to our guest, Charlie Pierce. Charlie, it is so much fun to talk to you every single time I get a chance to talk to you. It is an honor. I feel like I learned something from you each and every day. You are one of my absolute heroes in this world for the truth that you speak, the way that you do it. You're just one of my favorite people, dude. So I'm so happy that we had this time together and to be able to sit and talk to you. It's just amazing. And another amazing person is our intrepid producer, Fletcher Powell. You can find Fletcher, who does this work day in, day out, all hours of the day. You can find him on Twitter at Fletcher_Powell, and follow him for more intrepid advice and the sane voice of reason behind HATM, if you will. And thank you, of course, to you guys as well. Thank you every day for coming in, continue to listen, to share this podcast with your friends, to talk good things, to leave reviews, to subscribe to it. Thank you for being part of this community. We would not be here without you. We could not continue to do this without you. So just want to make sure that you guys know that. So continue to spread the gospel of HATM. I sure hope you like this podcast. I sure loved bringing it to you. So thanks for being here today. Keep coming back for more. And we'll see you next week, probably for Robin Hood. So talk to you a little bit later. Ciao for now.